Welcome to Approaches to Listening. I'm William Taylor, the host and author. Episode 1, 4 Filters. I almost dropped out of music school. Twice. Once in my bachelor's degree and once in my DMA program. There are many factors that contributed to my near decisions to quit, but ultimately it boiled down to me not receiving what I wanted when the music I loved intersected with university study. My struggles with my music programs led me to question if music was the right career for me, even though I knew that music was what I wanted to do regardless of what degree I held. And these decisions were especially difficult because I had feedback from teachers that I trusted that I excelled at music and had significant contributions to make as both a musician and an academic. This podcast was created to address questions about music that I couldn't find satisfactory answers to within my university studies. In those years of study, I've heard professors teach some of the answers to the questions I address, but the university requirements frequently contradicted or diminished the things that I found really mattered in music and music making. Primary among those diminished elements is listening. Listening is connected to the essence of music. And while universities have oral skills, listening labs, listening examinations, and music literature courses, I still believe that they do a poor job at teaching music students how to really listen. I also believe universities actively promote a honed but restrictive form of listening that damages both performers' ability to make powerful music as well as their ability to enjoy the music they hear to the fullest degree. Now, universities need measurements to function. Tests, grades, and deadlines are part of the system of measurement. For musicians, these measurements translate to juries, recitals, projects, and exams that are governed by a strict rubric. The problem is that measurements mean that everything can be counted and distinguished on a pass-fail continuum, and music is much more than that. The following quote is attributed to Einstein, who said, "Not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted." University music programs teach and test the things that can be counted, but often leave out the more essential things that can't be counted, which brings us back to listening. How do you measure listening? And how do you know if these things that can't be counted are real? This will be a recurring question throughout this podcast, but I'll offer some introductory examples of why this matters. In conversation, does it matter if someone really listens to you? And how do you know that they really have heard you? And how does that make you feel? It's hard to quantify those things. They're hard things to count, but they matter a lot, and we feel the absence and presence of these uncountable things. Another example. You're moved to tears at a performance of the Brahms Intermezzo in A major. The performance was flawed, and there were background sounds from a cafeteria that connected to the recital hall. This is based on a real experience, by the way. Later, you hear a good performance of the same piece, but didn't feel anything extraordinary, and didn't walk away with a significant experience. What is the difference? And why did one performance have a profound impact on you while the other didn't? I don't know if you can count all the elements that made a difference between these two examples, but the differences are real and are well worth seeking an investigation. More often than not, I believe that in music, the things that you can't count revolve around listening. Listening is at the very heart of music, at its very essence. Why do I believe that? Because I don't believe it's possible to experience music without some form of listening. I found a 4-part cycle that helps explain the process of taking in music, with those 4 steps being listening, hearing, feeling, and thinking. This process or cycle goes like this. How you listen determines what you hear, and what you hear determines how you feel and think. I'll repeat that one more time as it's central to this podcast. How you listen determines what you hear, and what you hear determines how you feel and think. Universities are focused on education, or improvement and development in your chosen field, and they measure that success using syllabi and course requirements. You don't have to demonstrate the things that can't be counted to get A's, degrees, awards, or performance opportunities. This has resulted in the following treatment of those things that can't be counted. 1, they're not taught. 2, they're taught but not prioritized and are inadvertently given a low-ranking spot in the hierarchy of university musical education. Imagine the following scenario. It might not be hard to imagine. You spend a year improving your technique, learning and memorizing repertoire for recital. You take it piece by piece, technique by technique, and tackle one studio class performance at a time. Eventually, you have your jury, the jury is passed, and you have a few weeks before recital day. And now your teacher starts introducing elements that can't be counted. You'll hear phrases like sing it or bring it to life, tell a story, really mean it. Now musicians tend to know the real thing, which includes elements that can't be counted, from the almost real thing. But in our university education, we spend 98% of our time focusing on the measurable stuff. Then, once the recital, a performance, or the apex of learning to play, once the recital comes, we try to bring out the core stuff that really matters, but we've only given it an iota of the time we allotted to everything else. Now, how do you know if that uncountable stuff is there? You listen. Once your ear, mind, and heart align through active listening, only when your listening becomes hearing that expands your feeling and thinking can you identify if the uncountable music is there. The real stuff, the live stuff, the type of music that sparked the feelings that made us say, I want to be a musician. It can only be accessed through listening, and listening is not properly taught in any kind of music lesson I have seen in North America, from beginning lessons all the way to doctoral programs. That's what this podcast will explore and teach. How to listen to music. How to hear it so you can understand it and feel it as deeply as possible. Without further delay, let's jump into how listening can be improved. I have a question to open this part of the episode. How do you tell a good listener from an amateur listener? Or who's the best listener and how would you know? Another question. How do you listen to music? It's a question worth asking for anyone who spends a large amount of their time either listening to or making music. I'd argue that we know how we make music better than how we consume it. But the two are connected, perhaps more than we know. Moving forward, this episode will lay out how listeners can more intentionally connect with music by utilizing 4 specific approaches to listening, 2 of which are very well represented in academia, 2 of which are not. I call these approaches filters. These filters are the analytical filter, the critical filter, the experiential filter, and the exploratory filter. Each of these filters represents a different way of listening to music. And again, how you listen determines what you hear, and what you hear determines what you feel and think. We'll take a look at each filter, beginning with the analytical filter. I would say the analytical filter is the primary filter for academics. You need to analyze music to pass your courses and graduate. When you analyze a piece, you are identifying and labeling elements that make up the work. You're taking the music apart piece by piece to understand both the individual components and how all the parts connect. This could be through form and analysis, a theoretical analysis, or by comparing and contrasting works using your knowledge of music history. Going back to Einstein's quote, you are counting things that can be counted. University-trained musicians excel at this type of listening and have plenty of opportunities to utilize it. This is a filter that draws on your knowledge to engage with a piece, meaning you use information that you've already been taught to engage with the music. You cannot analyze without systematized knowledge, so listeners can either utilize an existing system of analysis or form their own. University musicians are taught music history and music theory in a systemic manner, which enables their analysis. But those aren't the only systems that can be used. Leonard Bernstein exemplified this in his Young People's Concert Series, where he taught how to identify important elements like musical ideas in threes, as found at the beginning of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. This gave listeners knowledge about the piece without needing to explain, say, the chord progression within the first three gestures of the symphony. Another example is this. I really like popular songs that feature bowed string instruments. Here I use instrumentation as an analytical tool in a custom-made system that helps me identify what popular music I like. Without a system of analysis, you are likely to default to another listening filter. Let's move to the critical filter now, as it has a smooth segue from the analytical filter. The critical filter is used to evaluate, whether that's in our practice, a performance of a piece, or to evaluate the piece as a whole. Juries are a prime example of the critical filter's use, and in a jury, an established rubric will tell you where to set your expectations. With the critical filter in place, you can determine whether the piece or its performance meets your expectations or needs. This filter tells you whether the interpretation was tasteful, or if the piece and performance were acceptable for the performer's skill level. Ultimately, it's used to determine if you want more music like this or not. Needless to say, there are places where you should really avoid this filter, or ensure you use it contextually. Beginner recitals, especially for kids, would be a terrible place to utilize all your critiquing capabilities as a university-trained musician. Short 20 to 30 second clips of pop songs do not provide enough information to accurately use this filter either. When you have no context and a small sample size, you should avoid evaluating a segment as if it were the whole, especially when you have no idea what the whole looks like or sounds like. Personally, I've been very guilty of this with popular music, especially as a teen. I'd hear 10 seconds of a chorus and criticize the 1-6-4-5 progression, the singer's diction, their breathy quality of voice, and the stupidity of the lyrics. Did I know the artist's style? Did I know the subject of the song? Did I know if this was an amateur or professional? No, and no, so I should have avoided judgment or critique. This filter can be extremely gratifying, especially when you evaluate a favorite artist and can't find a single flaw because the performance is that good. That experience engenders a lot of trust in the performer and their music, and once that trust is established, it sparks deep and active listening. For me, it removes any obstacles I might have to enjoying the piece. On the other hand, if you're repeatedly let down by the music you listen to, or you're let down by a performer you've always subscribed to, then it's time to review your rubric of evaluation or the performer's place in your library. There is so much music in the world. We really need this critical filter to sort the music we want to listen to again and again from the music we were content to hear once. If we don't, then we're investing in music that might or might not give us what we want. Perhaps more than any other filter, the critical filter can rob you of the joy of listening, especially if it's overused or never given a break. Let's shift to the filters that aren't as present in academia: experience and exploration. We'll start with experience. The experiential filter is a filter that I think we've all used but don't always know how to employ. It's also a filter that is based on feeling, not thinking. It's hard for trained musicians to turn off their analytical or thinking brain. But if you only know how to connect with music through thinking, then you are missing out on more than 50% of what music offers. More about that in a future episode. The thought, "Here comes that amazing augmented sixth chord," is not likely to spark the same amazement and wonder the third or fourth time that it did the first. Feeling, however, can repeat that experience, or even surpass previous experiences. Popular music exemplifies experience-based music. Popular artists have refined the technique of giving you a relatable, accessible, and generally speaking, an emotionally based experience for 3 to 4 minutes. which commonly includes their utilization of video elements. But they don't have a monopoly on experience-centric music. Classical music is also amazing to experience, but we commonly stumble in our efforts to experience it because of its longer forms and our overuse of the critical and analytical filters. It's worth saying again that the experiential filter is a feeling filter, and actively engaging with and fueling your feelings is not often seen in classical performances, even if it's happening. If you think about it, it can be almost comical to see a stoic audience listening to Respighi's Appian Way, but perhaps there's something about experiencing so much internally until you finally get to clap. So how do you optimize experience while listening? Or how do you actively experience music? Performers spend a lot of time honing the experience that they'll offer their audience, so how do we engage with that aspect as much as possible? Here's where a key difference between the thinking filters and feeling filters comes in. And just to clarify, I would categorize the critical and analytical filters as thinking filters, and the experiential and exploratory filters as the feeling filters. The key difference between the two types of filters is this: how they interact with time and cause you to interact with time. Music is sound in time, so the time factor is crucial to understand. Looking at the analytical and critical filters, they take a long or extended view of time. If you're going to analyze a piece, you need to learn or devise a system of analysis, which is a lengthy investment. Likewise, for the critical filter, you're stepping out of the moment to determine what type of music you'll call good and engage with again and again. With both filters, you can also go back and refine your thoughts, meaning that analysis and critique really have no time constraints on them. Both critique and analysis can also be done quickly. They can even be rushed and remain accurate. But the same is not true of experience and exploration in listening. For example, can you listen faster or slower? Can you feel a piece of music faster or slower? And I'm not talking about tempo here. I'm talking about what you might experience during a musical performance. Understanding, shock, awe, peace, excitement. So my answer would be no, you can't listen or feel faster. The adverbs faster and slower are perhaps antithetical to the nature of the verbs listen and feel, and it's important to outline the time restrictions inherent in experience and exploration. To utilize the experiential filter, your active listening will require you to engage with the music in the moment, meaning that lethargy or a rushed feeling will restrict or distort the experience. I found that to be true a lot in my master's degree, when there were many days when I wanted a connection with art, but only had 5 minutes before I had to rush from appointment to appointment. I really wanted a musical experience, but would sit down and try to cram it in while I didn't have time to listen. Well, the mix of my rushed mindset and my active listening attempts almost always tainted the experience I wanted. To experience a piece through active listening, you must meet it in the moment, and hold on to that moment throughout the piece, wherever it takes you. And that leads us to our final filter, exploration. How do you listen to a piece you don't know? Do you start analyzing it right off the bat, or even start critiquing it within the first 30 seconds? Or do you try to experience it without any frame of reference? I've tried all of those approaches, and have had pretty inconsistent results with my listening. Instead of one of those three filters, I would recommend adopting an attitude of exploration. The first specific use of the exploratory filter is during a first listening. Soapbox moment. Trained musicians tend to squander our first listenings in a shameful way. Musicians study incredible repertoire, and occasionally we get to hear a masterpiece that we haven't encountered yet, and we usually engage it half-heartedly in our first encounter. After that, our first impression is formed, and if we only gave it a half-hearted listen, then we start to build our conception of the piece off of fragments of the work, the problem being that we never saw the forest for the trees. We tend not to listen very well if we don't know what we're looking for. If you think about that for a second, that raises some major red flags for principles like critical thinking or immersive engagement. And it's really sad if you think about patterns of communication and conversation outside music. We tend not to listen very well if we don't know what we're looking for. It's important to listen well, especially if you don't know what you're listening for. That's what exploration is about. Actively listening to find out what is there without analyzing or critiquing it. Now, there's an acute time restriction on this filter. You only get to listen to a piece for the first time once. First impressions last a long time, so they should be approached intentionally. Once you've honed your use of this filter, it also offers a great gift, a chance to reshape your foundational perceptions about a piece. The filter, or attitude of exploration, allows you to let go of what you know and just take in everything at face value. It's easy to be a half a second ahead of the music when I'm listening to a piece I know well. But exploration helps you forget that a subito forte is about to happen, or that the bass is going to drop a third to make a seventh chord into a ninth. Analysis and exploration work very well together if you can do both. Analysis is focused, out-of-time study that's driven by thinking. Exploration is a general and in-time experience and is based on feeling. Feeling and thinking, the other will show you what the opposite can't. If balanced properly, they'll feed each other to no end. And that's why I argue that thinking or feeling alone will give you less than 50% of the total benefits that music offers. Here's a measure to know if you're exploring or not. If you find yourself judging a work, or if you find yourself getting stuck in a thought, then you are not exploring. Author Mortimer J. Adler said, "To disagree before you understand is impertinent. To agree is inane or stupid." Feel free to explore before you delve into the measurable analysis and apply a rubric to critique the piece. If you skip exploration and experience, you're far less likely to find the heart of the music, the stuff that can't be counted, but really counts. Here are a couple of thoughts to wrap this episode up. All filters have a degree of crossover, but choosing your primary filter can make all the difference in your listening. As a note, each filter will have an in-depth episode on this podcast. This episode just serves as a brief introduction to all four, so I can build on the foundation of these four filters. Now, returning to an earlier question, how do you tell a good listener from an amateur, or who can listen the best? I'll give a partial answer, which is this. The best listener is someone who can use any of these four filters at will and knows when to apply each one. The best listener can choose their approach to listening. Thank you for listening. Please join me for the next episode in 2 weeks. If you'd like to support me or see more of my work, please visit my Patreon page or submit your email to my newsletter. The links will be in the show notes.